the allocation of the incoming resource flow. It's what happens to the resources once they enter the economy. How much goes to produce red cars? How much to produce blue shirts, lighthouses, televisions, houses and hospitals? I put lighthouses and hospitals here because they're examples of public goods, and I might get onto that soon, whereas these are what are referred to as private goods. So we want to make sure that the incoming resource flow is allocated in the best possible way to get the most value from that incoming resource flow. That we don't have too much going to red cars and not enough to lighthouses and so on. Then, of course, the distributional equity issue relates to, okay, once we produce these things, who gets them? You know, does 10% of society get most of these or have access to these things and the other 90% not? We want to make sure that that's fair and just. All right, let me just, I've sort of covered some of these points here. In terms of this distributional equity, I'll mention a couple of things. What I think is important in terms of distribution, income and wealth, making sure it's fair and just, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be equal. In fact, I would argue it's impossible to have an equal distribution of income and wealth, because you could give everyone the same size house, but a person who's got a house on the Esplanade hasn't really got the same level of wealth as a person who's got the same size house in an industrial area. So what, you make them have a slightly smaller house to even offset and so on. So you can't do it anyway, but what it basically means is that we at least should ensure that people have a minimum income level. And to some extent we sort of do that, although of course we leave people unemployed and they have to get by with a dole, and you could argue that that's not a living amount of income. Then there's the question of whether we should have maximum income levels, whether we should start taxing people at 100% at some stage. Now, that's fairly controversial, but if we're talking about, if we're talking about a steady state economy, then it may be necessary to actually put limits on the maximum amount that people earn. It would probably cut in at a very high level, but some people say, well, that would take out the incentive to work and what have you. I won't go into too much, but there's a thing called an economic rent. And it's not rent as you think of rents in terms of paying rent to have a house. It's a more broader economic term. And people have actually argued that anyone that earns beyond a certain amount, I guess it changes over time. I'll use a ballpark figure. You could perhaps argue that anyone who earns more than about $250,000, $300,000 a year is earning an economic rent. So in other words, they're earning something beyond their contribution to society, so it ought to be taxed at 100%. And it's also in relation to real estate, land prices and so on, how you can actually earn income by doing nothing other than just purchasing something that becomes scarce as population rises, demand rises. You become rich by doing nothing other than just owning something that becomes scarce. That is an economic rent as well. You may have heard of Henry George, who wrote a book, an American economist in the 19th century, came out in the 1860s, called Progress and Poverty. And he said we could virtually get away with all taxes and just have 100% land tax, which would tax all economic rents and so on. And we wouldn't have to have all these other distortionary taxes that I'll perhaps talk about soon. But anyway, thinking about this minimum income level and maximum income level, we might, in thinking about this, place a restriction on the order of magnitude difference between the minimum and the maximum. All right? How much more should the maximum be compared to the minimum? Just to give you some idea how things have changed, there was a study that was done that showed in 1960 the average CEO was paid 12 times that of the average factory worker. By 1974 it was 35 times, and by 1995 it was 135 times. I don't know what it is now. But I would have... it is obscene. But you might argue that perhaps in about 1960, CEOs were probably paid right up the top of what might be considered where the economic rent starts, right at the maximum. And ever since then, they've been earning these economic rents, and they should be taxed at 100%. The thing about an economic rent is, if you tax someone at 100% beyond the maximum income level, it doesn't affect the way they offer their labour. Now, if Shane Warne was on $1 million contract with the Australian Cricket Board and you taxed Shane Warne at 100% above $100,000, Shane Warne would not have done something else. He would have still been an Australian cricketer. Now, I don't know what his economic rent might have been, but if it was $900,000, you can efficiently tax that away and it doesn't affect their labour supply decisions, or his labour supply decision. It's the most efficient form of taxation available. Land is still supplied. Sorry? Go to England. Well, see, now there was something almost equivalent to that. You know, the Beatles were being taxed at almost 100%. Sorry? 99%. So so it's not as if this hasn't occurred before. There is a precedent. You probably need it where, and international issues are critical because people can disappear, go overseas and avoid these sorts of things. Anyway, role and limits of the markets. We've got these three policy areas: sustainability, distribution and efficiency. How effectively we use that incoming resource flow, assuming that it's sustainable. Okay. I would argue, and ecological economists argue, that the markets and the price mechanism serves a very useful function in terms of that allocation of resources, where resources should go. They don't do a perfect job, but it appears that it's the best possible mechanism that we have available for the efficient allocation of resources. Yes, they do fail, and I've got examples of failure here, market failure here, which you learn in your first year economics topic. Public goods. If we relied on the market or the private sector to provide all our public goods, we wouldn't get enough of them. So we have to have government intervention. Governments supposedly provide sufficient quantities of public goods. They used to, they're not doing as good a job now. Imperfect competition, natural monopolies. The argument is that a natural monopoly is a form of market failure. Governments should own natural monopolies. They used to, now they're privatising the things. So they're actually contributing to market failure. This interests me because governments used to do a pretty good job with public goods, a reasonable job in terms of imperfect competition, natural monopolies, used to do a reasonable job with overcoming imperfect information, so they'd provide information. They don't do that anymore. They've turned it into political advertising, and they've always been woeful at dealing with externalities. Now, at a time where there seems to be more reliance on the market, you'd think that the government would be intervening to make sure the market works better, yet they seem to be doing worse. So markets do fail. They don't. So in terms of this wrong direction, where the resources go, markets do a pretty good job, but they fail to some extent. But the cost of that failure is generally less in most instances than providing utilising some alternative resource allocation mechanism. So government should intervene to make markets work better. But my argument is that they're only useful in terms of this allocation aspect. In terms of the sustainability aspect, markets should not be involved at all. In terms of the distribution, markets should not be involved at all.
Sorry.
Yes?
You're talking about unregulated markets or...
Well, I guess... Well... No, not really, because the fact that what I'm about to argue is that markets should be used in terms of efficiency, but not in terms of distribution and sustainability. So there will be the regulations that will regulate the market. So they will discipline the market anyway. No, there never is to a full extent. So let me just go, because I've sort of talked. So they're the two areas that we shouldn't allow markets to stray in terms of distribution of income and wealth and sustainable rate of throughput. Now, if you ask an economist about whether markets should stray into the distribution side, and you read the average sort of undergraduate textbook, they'll agree that markets shouldn't be involved in the just distribution of income and wealth. That's why we have a welfare system that involves taxes and transfers, because the market, if we left everything out the market, some people fall through the cracks and end up with nothing. So we have a welfare system. That's why we have tax rates that tend to be progressive, higher marginal tax rates for high income brackets. That's why we have welfare payments for poor and the needy, although I would argue that the role of government in redistributing income and wealth has been diluted. All right, we've got things like work for the dole now, tougher eligibility criteria for welfare payments, and this concept of mutual obligation, as if somehow governments don't have an obligation to ensure people are employed.